Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Cast Dice, the podcast that explores the great big wild world of tabletop gaming that exists today. It has been said, mainly on this podcast, that we are in the middle of a gaming renaissance. There are just too many good games out there that we can spend our hobby time and our hobby dollars on. It can lead to a serious case of not knowing what to play next. And I guess that's what we talk about on this podcast. The games that my guests and I either play and enjoy, or events that we've gone to and we're reporting back on what's happened, or where we get to speak to some of the creators of those games, and we get to talk about how they come into being. Now, today is an incredibly special day for me for a lot of reasons, and it is one of my favorite guests. But before we get to the big man himself, the big kahuna, we are going to take one step to the right, and we are going to look at the larger gaming industry. And there has been an unbelievable amount of talk recently about Warhammer 40K, 9th edition. Now, we don't usually talk about Warhammer games, many Games Workshop games on this podcast, and I would like to be clear, I am not anti-Games Workshop. I have never been anti-Games Workshop. I tend to talk about the things that I'm playing and I'm into at the time, and without Games Workshop, I wouldn't be talking to you today. Games Workshop hired me. I learned to talk probably as much and as loudly as I do now because I worked for Games Workshop for as long as I did. And what got me into Games Workshop in the very first place was a game called Warhammer 40,000. Now, did it start my gaming journey? No. I started with games like BattleTech, Car Wars, Marvel, superheroes, role-playing, Dungeons & Dragons, Ogre, then the list goes on and on. I played a ton of games, but it wasn't till I cracked Rogue Trader and I read the description of what a bolter does that I became truly hooked by gaming. I mean, I was pretty obsessed before that. But with just reading that little paragraph, my life literally changed to the point where I now live in Australia and I've met my wife, and everything that is good and important in my life, to a large degree, is responsible, Games Workshop is largely responsible for that journey, so to speak. Now, there's been a lot of discussion of the upcoming 9th edition Warhammer 40,000 today. And it would be a responsible podcast topic if I was a sensible guest to say, or host to say, let's get someone on and talk about that new edition. Let's get on there and, let's talk about all the hype. Let's get on that hype train and woohoo. But we're going to go a slightly different direction. We're going to go the other way. And we're going to go all the way back to the beginning. And we are going to talk to the man whose name is on the binding of Warhammer 40,000 First Edition, Rogue Trader. Not the board game, the book, the game in 1987 that started it all. The man, the myth, the legend, Rick Priestley. Welcome back to Cast Dice.
Hi, Brad. I can't tell you anything about the 9th edition of Warhammer 40,000, I'm afraid, but another time maybe.
Oh, I don't know if I'm ready to talk about Warhammer 40,000 9th edition, and I'm okay with that. So I've had requests to talk about old Hammer, I guess is what some people call it, for a long time, because I have a lot of people who listen to this show, who know how much Warhammer 40,000 meant to me and how much it has shaped me as a gamer and as a person and everything. And I don't say that lightly. And so I've had a lot of requests over the years to talk about 2nd edition Warhammer, to talk about Rogue Trader, to talk about my favorite edition of Warhammer 40,000 and to critique them because I played them up through 6th. But I thought, when I got another one of those requests, who better to have on than the man who's, as I said, whose name is on the binding? Now, we have talked off air, and it does take a village to create something as long lasting and as epic as Warhammer 40,000. But you are largely responsible for a large chunk of that. Rick, I know that we've talked on other podcasts about your history with gaming and sort of how you got started with Games Workshop. But how did your name end up on the binding of what is probably the most popular game in gaming history?
Well, I wrote all the text, so that's that was my book. When I first joined Games Workshop, I actually had a game that I developed and designed the models for myself, which was called Rogue Trader, and it was actually a spaceship combat role-playing game.
Oh, nice!
It was something which I just happened to sort of be inspired by the concept, and so I suppose a little bit like Traveller, but it was very based on spaceships, and I actually made a range of spaceships that I did sell to Citadel at the time. And when I joined Games Workshop officially, one of the understood things was that at some point Citadel would produce that game. Well, they never did, largely because events overtook us. But the name Rogue Trader had already been talked about. And in fact, there's an advert in one of the early compendiums, I think, for that spaceship game.
Yes.
And and because there was an advert for it, there was an eternal sort of anticipation for Rogue Trader. So when we eventually got to work on the game that became Rogue Trader, I mean, really it was a bit of a personal project. In fact, it was commissioned out of house. I wrote that game, all the text for that game, and developed that game entirely in my own time, as we all did at the time. It's worth bearing in mind that it probably wasn't until about the time this was published, 1987, that we actually started to employ, I'd say, proper games designers and developers, people whose job was to develop and design games in-house. Up until that point, those of us who'd been designing games, basically me, basically me, had been doing it out of house. The job we had was putting things together, so magazines, catalogs, and games. Our job was production rather than games design.
Yeah.
The concept of paying someone to do games design was it just wasn't there. Which is why when the game was originally published, I actually got a small royalty on it. Which I didn't subsequently, so unfortunately I'd be a very, very rich man today.
I was going to say, and your Ferrari collection is over there. Yeah,
it certainly would be, but I'm sadly not. It didn't work like that. So really, that Warhammer 40,000 game, Rogue Trader, it was kind of born of the fact that I always anticipated doing that original game. But over time, that original game morphed into our fantasy version of Warhammer because we'd started to incorporate technological elements into Warhammer. And we did that very early on. If any of you remember first edition Warhammer, even second edition Warhammer, there was an element of science fiction in it. And we published articles in the journals and the original Citadel journals and the original Citadel compendiums. We published articles in those which had rules for science fiction weapons and ancient lost artifacts that were the equivalent thereof. So the concept of science fiction Warhammer was something which I kind of just brought into Citadel. Now, at the time, I had a great enthusiasm for it, and it was one of those things where every time we had a project to do, I'd go, "Oh, can I do Rogue Trader? Can I do Rogue Trader?" And Brian Ansell would always say, "No, we want you to do this other thing." Generally, it's fantasy, something or other.
Yeah.
"We want you to do this other thing. Can you do this other thing first?" "Yeah, one day, but can you do this other thing?" And The reason was that there was a perception at the time that science fiction didn't sell. And that was almost a mantra. It was one of Brian's mantras, in fact. Science fiction does not sell. And he had a go at it himself over the years with various things, including for tabletop games. As had I. I had already published a science fiction game with Richard Halliwell called Combat 3000.
Mm-hmm.
And Brian had already published a game called Laserburn.
That's right.
Which he designed a range of miniatures for tabletop games. So, and they'd done all right, but I don't think they'd been particularly successful. And science fiction games, I think TSR did a science fiction role-playing game. I can't remember what it was called off the top of my head.
Spelljammer. Oh, no, before Spelljammer.
Before that
was D&D. I'm sorry, Star Frontiers.
Star Frontiers, that sounds about right.
Mm-hmm.
And that didn't do very well. You know, there was a Metamorphosis Alpha was an early kind of science, and that was all right, but it was very much of a second division sort of thing. Mm-hmm. Fantasy was very, very hot. Science fiction wasn't. So the assumption was science fiction didn't sell, and that was one reason why, you know, there was no real enthusiasm to do my game. And it's particularly true when it came to miniatures. And the other truism was that no one buys aliens. It says so science fiction doesn't sell, and nobody buys aliens. You know, was the aphorism. And this would be repeated now every so often, every time the subject came up. But eventually, what happened was, Games Workshop was expanding, and we acquired a whole raft of people from TSR. And this includes, I'm sorry if I've missed anyone out, it includes Jim Bamborough, Graham Davis by association. I don't think he actually worked for them, but he did work for them, and he came to work for us. Mike Brunton, Phil Gallagher are the four games designers that spring to mind immediately. And we also acquired a board games designer called Stephen Hand, I think. Richard Halliwell came over for a spell of work. Richard Halliwell was one of these people who worked on and off. He'd work for a year and then disappear for a year on a world trip. And he did that cyclically throughout his entire career, really. But he was there at the time. And Jervis Johnson joined us from sales. He designed Blood Bowl. So all of a sudden, instead of having one person, essentially he was a games designer and a bit of a staff around him, we had quite a big staff. And my role, therefore, kind of changed. And instead of being sort of jack of all trades, theoretically studio manager in the very early days, but, you know, there was only me, Tony Ackland, and John Blanche. And it's not as if I could tell either of them what to do, is it?
John Blanche has a venerable reputation. I don't know about the other gentlemen's.
Oh, Tony Ackland. Tony and I got on really quite well. I mean, we still do to this day. And we were the first two members of the studio. In fact, me and Tony were the studio for quite a while, and then John joined us later. And you know, if you look at the early Warhammer, a lot of the humour and a lot of the art style in it, in particular, comes from Tony. But a lot of the humour is me and Tony bantering stuff in the office. You know, it has that sort of the terrible puns, for example. We'd compete.
And I'm so glad you did. That was one of my favorite things.
It was quite good fun.
Yeah.
But so what had happened by the time I, let's say 1986, was that we'd acquired this quite large staff. Yeah. So I my memory is vaguely me saying, "Oh, I'd really like to do Rogue Trader." And Brian sort of, because Brian Ansell would have been in charge of the. He wasn't in theory the studio manager, but he was in charge of the whole business. It was his business, really. Yeah. So I got kind of like tentative permission to spend time doing Rogue Trader on the basis that it would actually be published, simply because there was now so many other people to do things that they really wanted to do, like all the role-playing games, all the board games, all the there were a whole series of games for that we were trying to do for the book trade. You know, all of a sudden there were a lot of things happening, and because there were a lot of things happening, the enthusiasm for it wasn't clear what was going to be successful at that time. Remember, we got to deal with West End, I think, doing republishing their stuff. We'd got to deal with Chaosium republishing their stuff. So I think there was a sense at the top of the business. I mean, Brian Ansell really, and Keith Pinfold, his business partner, that Games Workshop was going to expand because we were going to be doing Chaosium games and all these role-playing games and so on and so forth. It wasn't so blindingly obvious as it might be nowadays that actually the money wasn't in that, but in the toy soldiers and in the war games.
Yeah.
So I got to do Rogue Trader not because it was seen as an important thing, but because it was seen as Rick, let's just let Rick do this thing and then he'll shut up about it.
Oh, history! The irony. Yeah. The irony is wonderful.
So the reason I got to do it, and the reason I got to do really pretty much what I wanted, wasn't because it was seen as being key to the business, but because it was the very opposite. I did something no one else wanted to do, because science fiction doesn't sell, and nobody buys aliens. Now, once I'd started putting the game together, I bear in mind at the time I was sharing a house with John Stallard and Anthony Epworth. And this was a bit like it was a shared house, but we also tended to have other people staying with us from work. So people like Charlie Elliott might stay over for a few weeks while they got themselves together. And so I think quite a lot of people did. So it was a little bit of a madhouse. It's been compared to the film Animal House.
Nice.
And it was a bit like that, to be honest.
I'm not going to be able to look at John now and not think Flounder. Or was Flounder? I can't. What was John Belushi's character's name in that movie?
John Belushi. It wasn't Flounder. Flounder was one of the two younger guys.
The younger guys.
Bluto.
That's it. Bluto.
Yeah, John definitely was John Belushi. And I think
yes,
one of his heroes as well, I think.
Yeah. Not surprised.
Well, it was a bit like that. And anyway. Famous for its parties, that house. And we would play the original version of what became Warhammer 40,000, which was never referred to as anything other than Rogue Trader at the time. We'd play the original version of Rogue Trader on the floor, usually, because the table was just full of toy soldiers and crap being painted. On the floor of that house, and it would be me, as I say, Ep and John, and perhaps a few guys from work, or some friends of John's that were just passing through, one of whom was a chap called Pete Cantor, who was just a mate of John's, really, a really nice guy. And it's interesting, because I was looking through the original book yesterday, because I knew we were going to be talking about it. And it actually has, in playtesting section of the credits, it actually has Pete Cantor's name. In fact, he's the first there, Pete Cantor. Oh,
that's funny.
And of course, that's Captain Cantor of the Space Marines.
Oh, that's awesome.
That's the original. He was the original Captain Cantor. And he didn't work for us or anything. But he was, he took part in those games. And, we enjoyed playing. And I ran them as role-playing skirmishes. They're skirmish war games, but with a huge role. Really, they were role-playing games. So I'd be games mastering it. And typically, a group of Space Marines would turn up on an alien planet that had suddenly... a research station had gone quiet and they were investigating, and of course it had been taken over by alien monstrosities from the warp that had eaten everyone's brains, as was the way.
Yes.
And all the models we'd be using would be converted fantasy figures mostly. We very early on we did have the very first Space Marine model. I think it's called LE2, and I think Bob Naismith made it. Quite early on, I got some of those and painted them up, because I've still got them to this day. But that was the only one we had. There were no others.
Those are the ones with the blank faceplates that look a lot like some of the new Forge World robots, sort of a hunched...
he's hunched over. He looks very much like a Space Marine, but he's walking along the slot. And he's got a typical Womble-type helmet.
Yes.
But he's got a gun pointing down, and the gun... just looks like somebody's taken a vacuum cleaner and made stuff up.
Yes. And
put a blade on the end. That's Bob Naismith made that.
I'm thinking of another model, but I know exactly which one you're talking about.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Yeah, right. Fair enough.
In fact, I have one of those. They're gorgeous. With the pointy, they have those little wee legs with the pointy kneecaps.
Yeah, it's got a site. It's based on chaos armor of the time.
Mm-hmm.
It's like the chaos range for fantasy was selling really well.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea of what Space Marine should look like was influenced by that. Let's make some chaos warriors in space.
Yeah.
And essentially that's what Bob Naismith. In fact, again, if you look at that credit page, it does say Space Marine models designed by Bob Naismith, and yet there's always endless arguments about who made them.
Mm-hmm.
And there it is: Space Marine original model designs Bob Naismith, and he did. Yeah, all the guys had a bit of go at some concepts for Rogue Trader, but Bob designed that Space Marine. But all the other models would be other things that we just converted. Usually, I used a lot of D&D monsters.
Mm-hmm.
So the Catachan Devils that are actually in that book would be things like carrion crawlers.
Yep.
Because we made a lot of that under license at the time. And I think my original Inquisitor model is actually a Mouth of Sauron from the Middle-earth range.
Oh, get out. Amazing.
Lord of the Rings range. Yeah. Which is a fantastic figure, and if you look at it, it just looks like a 40k figure.
Yeah,
it was made as the Mouth of Sauron. He's holding a scroll in his left hand, and he's got a skull-like face, and that was the keynote for the this is what an Inquisitor looks like. Mm-hmm. So, a lot of things were built out of other ranges. A lot of my human settlers were actually medieval figures with handguns. The twins had done a small range already. So, it was put together like that. And as we were playing, it became really a thing. It became a really popular night out at Rick and John and Epps' place, playing 40k. And because people came in from the broader business because they were staying with us. I mean, we were young lads. I mean, and they were younger than us usually, early 20s sort of thing. It kind of got in at the ground. So all of a sudden it became popular because it was popular because the staff were playing it.
Yeah.
It wasn't a top down, it was a bottom up, if I can use that phrase. Ground up.
Yeah.
It's a little bit healthier, isn't it? A ground up. A ground-up kind of movement, and it gradually seeped through, and it became obvious that this was going to be a really popular game because everyone was so keen on it. Everyone was so enthusiastic about it, and people like Bob Naismith, in particular, would play. In fact, Bob made a lot of the scenery that's in the original book for our games. So Bob brought something to it, and he, of course, is a figure designer as well as an artist. Actually, he's quite a good artist. So it acquired its character that way. And by the time I'd actually finished the text, which was about 1980, it was the same year it's published, I think, about early 87, I suppose. We'd got a little bit of a way with the model making, but it was so apparent it was going to be successful that there was suddenly a lot of resources got pushed into it, and plastics became a possibility. And at the time, we were sort of exploring plastics. I think we'd just recently employed a chap called John Thornthwaite to look after our plastics division. He used to work for Matchbox, and he partly owned a tooling company and a plastic injection molding company down in Wisbech. And that partnership meant that we were looking for projects to do. 40k was about to come out. Rogue Trade was about to come out. So, as I say, and the enthusiasm within the business meant that suddenly, from it being nobody buys science fiction and so on and so forth, lots of resources were suddenly put into it. But I'd already written it. So what happened was, I think things like what a Space Marine looks like, and to some extent, some of the detailing I wrote on the hoof, because I'd already written the book.
Right.
But that you tend to have to do, as the book's going through production, somebody turns up with a pit. You have to bear in mind all this artwork was commissioned by other people. I mean, I might have put in my original notes, can we have a picture of a Space Marine fortress exploded like an old Look and Learn magazine,
Yeah.
or something like that. I would have put something like that in, but what I got and what I asked for were two entirely different things usually. So you look at something like look at page 167. There's a picture there by Jez Goodwin, and Jez just kind of was inspired to do this picture. And it's a picture of a bounty hunter with a kind of Skaven creature.
Yes.
And it's a really nice picture, actually. It's a lovely concept, and it sort of fits in with the backstory quite well. You look at that picture. I hadn't seen that picture before it turned up, so I then wrote the bit of text that goes underneath it. I'd probably have said to Jez, "What's going on here, Jez?" And he would have said, "Well, it's a bounty hunter and his little friend." And I kind of took that, and I would have done that bit of text specifically for that picture. And that's true of a lot of the things here. You know, I would have stitched it together.
Yeah.
Then in some cases, I would have stitched things quite within by altering the text to make it can fit the picture, because I wouldn't have known what any of the pictures were when I wrote the text.
Oh, that's amazing. Because some of the captions were so good. And they were one of the things that hooked me as a kid, was that you would look at the pictures in this book were revolutionary at the time. They were just so unlike other things. Just the richness. You could fall into almost every one of those pictures. It created the world, but that was just the hook. But then as you started to read the words, it came to life, and it became, literally, as I said, it changed my life. The way, it was so dense and so rich. It was amazing. But I
think I was just surfing on it, really, just riffing on it, really.
But to have
it's amazing how fast.
Yeah.
It's actually amazing how fast this was done, and I think not stopping to count, not stopping to think too much is one of the things that gives it its character. Yeah. I'll tell you something else as well. I'm looking at page 56, 57. There's a spread of mutants here, and I think they're drawn by McKenna. What's his name? So McKenna. Each one of these pictures is based on a photograph of a member of staff.
Oh, get out. Oh my God! Now that you say that, I can actually pick a couple of these, maybe.
Yeah.
Now, which ones? Don't tell me which one's you, Rick.
Well, I know. I don't think I'm on that one.
Okay.
I don't think I'm any of these. It's page 56, 57.
Yep.
I don't think I'm any of these. Some of them I sort of recognise, but I can't quite put a name to.
Yeah.
But if you look at the top row, second one in on the left, that's Tony Ackland.
That's awesome.
If you go onto the page 57, the one in the middle with the sort of warty eyes, I think that's Ali Morrison.
That's awesome.
It looks like Ali.
It does.
And then if you go onto the bottom row, page 57, the left one with the crab eyes, that's Richard Halliwell.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Is John Stollard one of these, perchance?
No, I don't think so. No. They would almost certainly been studio staff.
Yeah, of course. Well, I'm glad you. Hold on. I'm going to derail you slightly. Since you brought up the mutant picture, one of the things that astonished me as a kid when I flipped open this book was the staff photo. There is and I'm flipping through looking for it now, but there is a picture. It is okay. I'm looking throughout the rest. Yeah, but to have a photograph like that of all of you was brilliant.
Sorry, you're thinking of the drawing. It's page 260.
Yeah.
Yeah, 260. Yeah.
There it is.
Yeah. What we used to we photocopied this and we put it on the wall, and then as people got sacked, we blanked them out like a Stalinist kind of purge. Trying to think, there's still a few there.
Yes, there are. Jervis is still there, at least. Yep.
Yeah, Jervis is, as Jez is still there.
Yep. Yes, he is.
He's sort of in charge of design now, and Ali Morrison is still there. I think that John Blanche is sort of there. He's kind of retired, but he's still there. Yeah, that's about it, I think.
Yeah. But it is, I mean, that photograph, looking at that when I was younger was just, I was like, this is the group that made this. And as I grew up, and as I read more, I guess, more British centric things, all of a sudden I got the Judge Dredd costume. I got, some of the other references that were in there stylistically. And then, of course,
Yeah.
I met some of you, and it made even more. I was like, oh, that's Rick.
Yeah, I have to say that there's a lot of 2000 AD.
Yes.
And I think people who, British people of our generation who remember 2000 AD, particularly that time, will have recognised it. But I don't think Americans did. I think that made it even more strange to an American audience. But you have to remember at the time, I just finished. I'd finished doing a role-playing game for Judge Dredd. So I'd actually sat down with piles and piles and piles of 2000 AD, and I had to read all the 2000 AD Judge Dredd stories.
Yeah.
But of course, I had I had the whole pile there, and I was always a great fan of 2000 AD, and particularly Pat Mills' stories. And there's quite a lot of Nemesis the Warlock.
Yes.
In Rogue Trader, and I think that's fairly apparent. It's not a sort of a direct inspiration. There's a lot of differences, but if you look at some of the imagery from that comic strip, you see it particularly in later Rogue Trader and what it became. I think.
Well, let's get to later Rogue Trader in a minute, and let's try and I'm going to try and bring you back a little bit to just prior to the game coming out. It's popular. The company's dumping resources into it. Now, something you've said before about aliens, no one buys aliens. One of the things that was so particularly familiar to me and what made me so excited about Warhammer 40,000 Rogue Trader when I first cracked the book was it was so recognizable. Because I played Star Frontiers, which is why I knew what it was. But the aliens in that game, you had like an amoeba who wore a spacesuit, and there was like a dog person. Like, those were cool and all, but they never grabbed me as a kid. And yet when I cracked Rogue Trader, there was an orc, there was an elf, and they were, orcs and Eldar, and everything. Actually, were they Eldar in this, or is it space elves? But there were dwarves, there were squats. And so for me, it was very familiar. Because you guys had the mantra behind closed doors of saying, aliens don't sell, is that why there's that Tolkien-esque feel to 40K?
It is. It's that thing where the fact that I wrote the game, and it wasn't until it was almost finished that it was realized that this was going to become big, meant that some of the things I did assume a different kind of, assume we're going to sell 5,000, sell through, and that's it.
Right.
And never do it again. That'll teach you, Rick. Nobody buys aliens. So although, I was given the green light on the project, there were certain things, and there were things which I think it would largely have been Brian Ansell who pretty much laid the groundwork, because at the end of the day, if I go and create a game that demands we make thousands of miniatures, they can't do it. So
right.
When you're designing a game, you have to kind of go, you almost have to negotiate in terms of what resources you can have. And the deal was, we're not going to make any aliens for this game because nobody buys aliens. So what we'll do, the original plan, and this is going back to, almost like right when I started writing it, we're not going to have any aliens. We'll have no resources for aliens. So what you have to do is make the maximum use of what we already have, i.e. D&D monsters and things like that. And people won't be buying aliens, but what they'll do is they'll be able to buy conversion packs so they can convert their fantasy figures into aliens.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah, that was the original plan. Now, I am going back to right at the start, and I think that plan fell by the wayside quite quickly. But that was the original plan. that's why when I started out, I said, right, well, we're already playing Warhammer fantasy with a bit of science fiction in it anyway, so it's not a big stretch. So we'll have space orcs, space elves, space dwarves, space goblins. We'll use those as the basis. Now, I'd actually already taken that idea for my original Rogue Trader spaceship game. In my original spaceship game, had the Eldar and had orcs with a K. It had those aliens, fantasy races in space idea behind it. So it wasn't exactly out of the blue, right. But that's the reason for it. And in fact, there are one or two things in here where we broke the rules, and one of them's Tyranids, for example. Now I've made an alien up there. In fact, It wasn't me that made it up. It was Nick Bibby. I've just given this is an example really of kind of what happened as the game was being developed. Nick sort of came to me and said, "I've got this really great idea for an alien, and it's got like 6 arms. And if you look at the picture, it's on page 201."
I was going to say 201. I'm looking at it now. Yep.
Yeah. Nick Bibby drew that. He's a very good artist, Nick. He currently works as a bronze sculptor, very good one too.
Yeah.
And he had this idea for this creature, and that's the creature. As you can see, its rear legs are kind of splayed out. And the idea was that as it runs along, its rear legs act as stabilizers. And that was the original Tyranid. And I think I came up with the name Tyranid, and I wrote this text to go with it. But the idea of that creature was Nick's. And I would have sat down with Nick and said, "What's going on, Nick? What do you reckon? Yeah. What does it do? What does it eat?" And so on and so forth. And that's actually me breaking the rules. And it's interesting that although the concept of a Tyranid, which I wrote here, pretty much stayed stable.
Yes, it did.
What it looked like, yeah. But the rest of it, that concept, that model doesn't look anything like a modern Tyranid.
Well, Rick, that looks like a proto-Hormigaunt if I've ever seen one, down to the flesh borer it's carrying. I mean, that...
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, the idea of having bioweaponry was one of Nick's concepts. So, and I've written it up, and it's actually, it does talk about here as having biological weapons and ships that are almost like a inside of a creature. So, the concept is there, but it only happened because Nick came up with that model. And I think because another thing was we had to make use of whatever we had. You'll notice the next entry on page 202 is Zotes.
Yes.
We happen to have these Zotes for fantasy, which I never liked personally. That was a bit weird.
Yep.
And we ended up with Zotes with sort of gas masks on, which just looks kind of peculiar. But I wrote them up as being like a Tyranid creature.
That's right.
One of their slave creatures, just because I had to do rules for everything. That was one of the other things. It was the other thing. So we couldn't have new aliens. Got a bit naughty with my Tyranids, but we had to make the use of whatever we had. Yeah. So hence those. And I think there's plenty of other examples in here.
The Emble, the Emble does look a little bit like a bugbear. Or an owlbear. I'm just saying.
It's a Umber Hulk.
Yes. Oh, of course. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, that's exactly it. I mean, and I was instructed really that anything we made as a monster that could be incorporated in, we would incorporate it in. Now, the problem was, because I couldn't literally call them the same thing or draw them the same way, they ended up being sufficiently different that people weren't prepared to use the things they were supposed to be using from their collections. Yeah. So the enslavers, which are beholders by any other name, and I use these a lot. The idea, I kind of changed them a bit in the way they work, but essentially, the model I used for enslavers when we were playing our original role-playing style games was the D&D beholder.
Yes.
But of course, when Tony drew it, he had to draw something specific. And I think the other thing that's rather obvious when you look at it is I think there are Daleks in here somewhere, and
there is
Cybermen.
There is a space marine that has a Dalek lower half somewhere in this book.
Yeah, right, okay.
Yeah.
Of course, we made them at the time under license, you see.
Oh, that's in Compendium. But yes, it is.
Yeah, could well be.
It's next to your famous deodorant land speeder.
Ah, yes, of course. Classic. Yeah. So the owl bear, since as you asked, is the Catholian cud bear on page 210. But again, it's one of those things that just no one quite got it. So it ended up being I don't know if we ever made one, but the idea of using your D&D monsters it never really caught on. Although this vast list of monsters, and including vegetable-based monsters.
Yes.
That's come from having spent quite a long time developing the same things for Warhammer roleplay. So I had this massive reservoir of things and ideas to draw upon, and did.
I was going to say, because I'm literally also now holding my Warhammer roleplay book, the creature section of that book and the creature section of Warhammer 40,000 Rogue Trader are spookily similar.
Well, it would be. So in context of it being a sort of semi-role-playing or role-playing skirmish game, with the Games Master, all these creatures and things were just part of that tradition. And some of them have gone on to become massive best-selling ranges like Tyranids, and others, like the Bouncers and Carnivorous Sand Clam, have disappeared.
I mean, it's got to feel weird to you, Rick, that some of those creatures that did die, died hard so many years ago, are now coming back into vogue.
I don't know that.
So Zotes are now out again.
Okay.
The Zote is a monster pack for Blackstone Fortress, and the dreaded Amble is in Blackstone Fortress. It's the new Warhammer Quest in space, and they are both attachments for that game, as is if you look at a number of things, GW seems to be, for the first time in a long time, and I know this has been going on for 3 or 4 years, but they have been going back and mining the old IP and bringing back some of the quote-unquote fan favorites. I mean, Gene Stealers were always, they were in this book and they look very different to what they are now, but I mean, when Space Hulk came out, you got the alien-looking Gene Stealer that we still know and love today. But Gene Stealer cults were something else, and I believe you said that was a Brian Ansell creation, the idea of the cult.
Yeah.
But Gene Stealer cult is now an army, and there's a picture in Rogue Trader that is a bunch of generals from different races standing around a table, like a holographic tank with some Space Marines in the background, and that table is now a Gene Stealer cult model. It looks exactly like it, except what's on the table is a top-down view of Nottingham, the GWHQ. It's a 3D model of that. But looking at that table, the very first thing I looked at, and they said that is straight out of Rogue Trader. And of course, it's Gene Stealer Cult, which is also from Rogue Trader, but from later in the run. Sorry, Rick, go ahead.
No, it's okay. It's 223, page 223. That picture.
There you go.
Yeah.
So it's got to be weird, and I mean, squats are starting to appear in Necromunda from time to time. So you're starting to see things that used to exist. I guess they're slipping mainly into specialist games.
It could be. I don't really know. Because I'm not aware of these things, I can't say as it does seem weird.
Yeah.
It is weird now you mention it, but I wouldn't have. I don't pay much attention to what Games Workshop have been doing for the past 10 years, which is when I left, and arguably the last 20 years.
Yes.
I've certainly not had an awful lot to do with 40K.
Well,
it's kind of gained a life of its own, really.
It does, and people. I mean, it's commonly talked about, and I recently did an episode of Cast Ice on BattleTech, and we were debating, the rich lore. Which game probably had a richer lore, BattleTech or 40K? And I think it's safe to say it's probably 40K. But it's amazing how much of that lore comes directly from both Rogue Trader, but more specifically, this book. So much of what we think of today, if you read through Rogue Trader, you look at it and go, man, that doesn't sound anything like what I'm familiar with. But there are so many things that you look at and they just draw you back. I haven't cracked the spine on Rogue Trader in a long time. And in looking back, in researching this, I was astonished at how much was in there. It's astonishing. Anyway, Rick, let's dial it in a little bit. And I have a specific question. I was going to ask, and I mentioned to a couple of friends that I was going to talk to you, and almost to a man, every single one of them wants to talk about the same thing, and it was something that I also want to know. So please let me ask you the most popular question for this episode. Space Marines. Now, you did talk about sort of how Space Marines came to being, or at least visually drew from Chaos Warrior armor. But the beaky Mark 6 armor is iconic to Rogue Trader, and is an integral part of that. Now, I know you wrote an entire article in White Dwarf at one point that literally set out Mark 1, Mark 2, Mark 3, and Mark 4, and it went through the whole lot. But Mark 6 is the one that we think of, at least grognards typically think of, as what Space Marines look like. Although a lot of people probably these days think of Mark 7 or beyond. How did Space Marines, A, come into being, but also B, how did you go from a Chaos Warrior to that? Do you know? Were you part of that process? I know you did a lot of the work. Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, I might not have been necessarily driving it, but I was there.
Mm-hmm.
Originally, and this would have been probably when I got the text about ready. What happened was, I think they wanted to start doing drawings or making models. He was probably making models, really. And they asked me, what these things look like. And I did some drawings. But to be honest, I'm not an artist. Mm-hmm. And I think what I drew was essentially, a futuristic soldier, mm-hmm. With a helmet that kind of looked a bit like the helmet from the 2000 AD strip Rogue Trooper.
Oh, interesting.
But the Souther helmet, not Rogue Trooper's helmet, which looks a bit like an American helmet, GI's mm-hmm. helmet. The Souther helmet, which looks a bit like a kind of, well, it's a bit like I suppose it could look a bit like a Roman first century AD helmet, a little bit, but it's got a visor. The whole front is a whole visor, and it turns into a breather mask. Mm-hmm. And I think I drew something very much like that because I thought that was quite a cool image. Mm-hmm. And in terms of his costume, I think I'd given him basically, it might have been overalls with it might have had a cross breather, like an X shape on the front. Mm-hmm. And that model got made, and it actually did get sold. It got put into the range of kind of adventurers or just random Imperial Guard figures. We had mm-hmm. a big dump code at one point, where a lot of the concept models just got sold off, mm-hmm. and that model did go in there. And it didn't really work. It just didn't look very exciting, which just shows you really you need figure designers to design figures. Mm-hmm. And I remember, and I did similar things with the Orcs and the Eldar and whatever, and we did actually make a whole range of concept models, a lot of them which just look like Orcs with guns or Eldar mm-hmm. with guns and things like that. And the figure designers kind of took those, and I think it would have been Brian Ansell, because he would have taken an interest by now, and probably Alan Merritt, who was in charge of the figure designers, who would have gone over some and gone, well, this isn't quite working. Can we do this? Can we do that? And by an iterative process, the models evolved to something that'd be more familiar.
Right.
But with Space Marines, we were really stuck. We couldn't quite get it. And I think in the end, I have an idea it was Brian Ansell, or it might have been just a conversation, but it would have been a conversation between people like Brian and Alan. It might even have been me, but it would be more likely to be by the figure designers like probably Bob. And the concept was just take a Chaos Warrior, and what they did is they took a Chaos Warrior concept. So those shoulder pads, that was what Chaos Warriors had at the time. You know, they had things like that, and I think that the leg armor, even I don't think it was particularly. You see, the original Space Marine didn't look like the Mark VI. The very original concept didn't have the flares.
Right.
It had some more conventional leg armor like greaves. And similarly, the bits at the elbows, which almost like it's called a pauldron in medieval armor terms. They had similar things at the knees originally, but the helmet was pretty much taken from my concept model, but they put that big beak on the front, like a medieval bassinet.
They did.
But to cover up the gas, it was still supposed to be a rebreather underneath it, but the bassinet shape really gave it a medieval look. So it was trying to give it a kind of look of a medieval or a chaos knight in space. And then, of course, you just stick that big backpack on it and give it a gun. Now, I think we call it a Mark VI, but when I did the original Rogue Trader book, there was no that Marks of Armor thing was something that came along later. And I think Jez was very keen on doing that. And what I wanted to do with the Marks of Armor was try and explore the history of the Imperium. So the different Marks of the Armor reflect periods of history in the creation of the Imperium. And that was really what I was interested in more than the actual armor. So you have that initial period when really the Chaos, the Space Marines were little more than Mad Max style road warriors.
Thunder Warriors.
I think that's, and that's essentially what they were. And that's essentially what the reunification of Earth by the Emperor in that great time of isolation was. And in my imagination, there was a whole story there and a whole game, if you wanted. And that was kind of what I liked doing with Rogue Traders and 40K was open doors all the time. Open a door. What happens if we went through that door? We won't go through it today. What happens if we go through this door? We won't go through it today. And I did a lot, and that Marks of Armor was a lot of door opening.
Yes,
so it might have been a lot of open doors. And later on, the Mark 7 armor was just Jez trying to refine the design. This Mark 6 armor, at one point you were asking about the legs in particular, because that flare armor is quite distinctive.
It is.
I think what happened was that they started, when they decided they were going to make plastic Space Marines, you have to bear in mind the process of making plastic figures compromises the design.
It does.
And at the time, we weren't very expert at it. So I suspect a lot of the features of the Space Marine armor were dictated by the compromising to plastic. And then when we make metal versions to go alongside it, we would have aped to the style. And then as we got more sophisticated with the plastic and a little bit more sophisticated in some ways with the design, and Jez would have refined, because Jez is a great refiner, and Jez would have refined that design and he created that skull-like, which, to be honest, is less distinctive in many ways. But it's been very, it's a very powerful image.
It is.
But that was for the future, at the time, this was just what Space Marines looked like. And I think that's how it happened. They just started as one thing, and gradually, by a process of compromise, to meet the needs of production and to meet the particular needs of plastic production, they got turned into something else, and the very quickly the weapons become one thing, because the plastic figure dictates that, and that bolter was created. I have no idea who first came up with that, but I invented the concept of bolter, but the bolter was already something. I say invented it. I took the concept of the bolter and wrote it up. It was already a concept in science fiction games and in science fiction background stories. It might even been called bolter in place. I think Laserburn has bolters in. That's one of the other things that people often say. They often say that Laserburn was the forefather of 40K. It wasn't really. What happened was when I actually started this project, Brian said to me, "You have to make sure that every science fiction weapon ever mentioned in any game is included, because people won't be buying miniatures to play this game." Foolish Priestley. No one buys science fiction models. If they've got models for another game, including things we'd already done with Citadel, they have to be able to recognise the name of the weapon. That's why a lot of the weapons in Rogue Trader have multiple names.
Yeah. Because
I couldn't invent all that many. So a conversion beam projector is also known as something else. It's sun gun or a displacer cannon or whatever. Yeah. And a bolter is also known as a gyrojet or a blast. There were a whole bunch of names, I said, that these things are sometimes called. And the reason was because I'd been asked to do that. In fact, I'd been told to do that.
Oh, really. That's hilarious.
Yeah, but having been told to do it, I kind of embraced the concept. It's fine. I can do that. It's easy. But that's one of the reasons people say, "Oh, this is just like Laserburn," because I used all the Laserburn weapons.
Yeah.
And Brian had done the same thing. I think it was a sort of a Brian thing, because he'd already done science fiction ranges for other people and been selling ranges of science fiction as part of his Asgard ranges and McEwen miniatures, for example, and the original. He's McEwen. There were different American companies that did science fiction, which was sold under license by Asgard, which had specific weapon names. So Brian had perhaps already started doing it, and he kind of he asked me to do the same thing, and I did. But there's nothing else really. I think later on, when other people started to add to the mythos and build it, they brought their own ideas in. And sometimes those ideas were in tune with the original book, and sometimes they weren't. But they were still powerful ideas, and if they were powerful ideas and they were the ideas that your boss was telling you to do, you did them.
Yeah.
So it wasn't within my gift. In fact, it was if Rogue Trader had stayed kind of the small role-playing game that it was intended to be, no doubt I would have been the developer for it. But because it became very much key to the business very quickly, I couldn't be the developer for it. It had to answer to a bigger a bigger demand, and there's no way I could personally do everything that was needed for it.
Yeah.
In fact, interesting, I found one of Brian's original memos tucked in an old box the other day. That was about the I think it's a chapter approved White Dwarf feature that we started doing pretty much as soon as this game was published.
Yep.
And it's not addressed to me, but I obviously got a copy. It was addressed to the people that were doing White Dwarf and to the miniatures managers. And he's tearing them off a strip because he's saying there's no way Rick can possibly do all this in one go. As much as he can do, he can't expect him to do this every single month. You've got to organise yourselves and get other people working on it. And it's no good waiting until the last minute to do all the drawings and artwork. You'll just end up with a complete mishmash that doesn't match, like you did for I think he quoted the Mentor Legion.
Yes.
And I'm reading this now and thinking, yes, well, he wasn't wrong. But from my point of view, I was just doing what I was being asked to do. And soon we had to get other writers on board to do things, particularly if they were ideas that weren't from me, to be honest, because something's general truism for ideas generation and games writing. It's very hard to get somebody else to write your idea for you. And if you do,
yeah, good
you
luck.
find
Yeah.
what you tend, it's like trying to get an art. And I tried to do this once, and I quickly realized why it was such a bad idea. You've got this brilliant thing in your head, but you're not an artist. So you go to an artist and you say, "Oh, I want it to be like this and this and this," and the artist goes, "Oh yeah, I get it," and they come back and they've drawn something completely different.
Yeah.
Because they can't get inside your head.
No. Yeah.
So the best you can do is try and explain what the ideas are and see what they can do. Give them as much freedom as you can to come up with stuff. And I think that's the trick in Rogue Trader and 40K, the early 40K especially, that rather than it being dictated by me, it was inspired by me, if I can say that.
Yeah.
And what was inspiring me was often other things. So they would bring their own ideas, but also their own inspirations. So John Blanche would bring a lot of that sort of late medieval Renaissance kind of feel, and the things we associate with John, they're more John than they are Rogue Trader, but because they got meshed, they became inextricable, and because people are visual, people think in visual terms.
They do.
The visual imagery is what people associate with Rogue Trader, not necessarily what I wrote.
Right.
Interesting, isn't it?
It is. It is. Oh man, Rick, I have so many questions, places to go next. You speaking there's a question in the back of my head that I don't want to know the answer to, but I'm going to ask it anyway. I know that in writing the description of the armors, that you were part of the process that came up with some of the ideas around what became the Horus Heresy. Now, when you look at the original Rogue Trader book, I know that there are a number of Space Marine chapters listed in that book, some of which we know to be founding chapters today: White Scars, Ultramarines, Space Wolves, Dark Angels, etc., etc. Some which have become, successor chapters: Flesh Eaters, Flesh Terrors, Rainbow Warriors, Silver Skulls, etc., etc. But the Heresy became a thing, and the original Space Marine game, which was epic, I guess, fleshed out a lot of the history and lore around that. But the chapters changed, and there was a definitive chapter list. And at some point, the history and fluff hard said there were 20 founding chapters, but we only know 18 of them. The 2 that were expunged, I'm assuming those were open doors, to use your analogy familiar. Were there ever any ideas for that? Were you part of the process at that point? Should I not ask this question, given that this is one of those Games Workshop still hints at?
I think the concept of having, the founding chapters, some of which have been, their memory's been damned. It's that thing about a Roman emperor or even an Egyptian pharaoh. They go and they hack off the cartouche, don't they, off all of his monuments to make sure that his memory is gone. There's no, and that was what inspired that idea. But it was always reflecting back into that kind of they call it heresy these days, but that time before the Imperium hardened. So I think the concept was there. Yeah, it wasn't really. Rogue Trader is just a list of chapters, isn't there? 11, in fact, I think. And then it cheerfully says there's 1,000. Yeah, that's opening some doors.
Yes, it is 1 or 2.
Yeah, and then there's a picture of the Space Marine chapters. Now, again, remember, I suspect my list got sent to the artist, but the artist would perhaps have done something else. No, these are all the original ones, aren't they?
Yep.
It was only I think it was in a supplement when we started to get some really wacky ones.
Yes.
And I didn't have anything to do with those. I had to put text to them after, in retrospect. But I don't think I think people just, it might have been Gary Chalk, just turned up with them, and I thought some of them were just a bit in a. See, I quite like the very brutal names that these guys have got.
Yeah.
Mind you, I said that Ultramarines is a gag, isn't it? But I quite, not to mention Rainbow Warriors.
Yeah.
But yeah, they're the Crimson Fist symbol is the symbol of the Tom Robinson Band, incidentally.
Oh, is it?
That clenched fist? Yeah, it was a symbol of the Tom Robinson Band.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, but yeah, I think the minute you start coming up with things like space sharks, I think, yeah, okay.
Yeah, exactly, right.
Yeah.
Well, let me riff off of that question then. I mean, I know Lehman Russ is in this book, wearing a rebreather over his face because his lungs were damaged, according to the fluff text. And then later on, somewhere, I don't believe it's in this book, it might be in Compendium, we first see Calgar sitting on his little chair with his buddies arming him. But the idea of, I mean, the don't get me wrong, the Space Marine chapter or section of this book is one of my favorites, favorite parts of it. But you really do get that idea, that whole structure, because I mean, there's the diagram of the Fang in this book as well. So some of the parts of what we know as, fortress monasteries, leaders of Space Marines, but not specifically called Primarchs, are here. Was that all something that you were a part of? I guess I should riff off of Space Marines at some point, but just curious.
Yeah, the names of I don't know where it is actually, but the names of these founding chapters and the founding Primarchs and the name Primarch, yeah, I did those. In fact, you can tell I'm quite good at recognizing my own made up names. Mm-hmm. I tend to have a certain ways of approaching them, and sometimes I recognize my own gags. Mm-hmm. And some of the gags I honestly can't tell you about because they're a little bit unsavory.
Oh, but come on, Rick! Come on, give us some salt. What do you got?
No, they might be considered politically incorrect these days.
Okay.
Well, I mean, one for example is I think the trying to think which chapter it was. One of them has the chapter. The Primarch is called, is it Perturabo or Perturabo?
Exactly.
Yeah, that was based on, although I think slightly misremembered, from the name that Aleister Crowley, the famous black magician, had when he was inducted into the Order of the Golden Dawn.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it means I shall endure.
Oh, fantastic!
Or I endure.
Yeah.
And what I was trying to, and the reason I was trying to do is make it clear that, into my own mind, if nothing else, that Space Marines are actually to some extent, they're a spiritual cult. Mm. To some extent, they are a religious organization. Mm-hmm. And the Emperor's blood does flow in their veins.
That's right.
So it's they have a relationship to the Emperor, which is actually deeper than their relationship to the Imperium. They should be dangerous. The Imperium should be barely. This is my rogue trader head on. Mm-hmm. The Imperium should be frightened of Space Marines, not because Space Marines are liable to turn to chaos or anything like that. Although they might, but because they regard the Imperium as it stands today as a bit of a Johnny-come-lately organization. Yeah, they are directly responsible and connected to the Emperor in a way that the actual Lords of Terror aren't. And arguably, the Lords of Terror and the Ministorum and all those organizations that have grown up in 10,000 years are a corruption of what the Emperor was standing for, in the same ways in which you look at the Catholic Church. And again, it gets slightly politically incorrect, and I apologize. I'm making an analogy, not a genuine religious observation. But if you look at the Catholic Church today, what relationship does that bear to the life of Jesus Christ and ministry of Jesus? It's a whole organization that's grown up, and a whole degree of what do you call exegesis,
Mm-hmm.
interpretation of both the Bible and writings of other people.
Exactly.
Have created what is modern Catholicism. And the whole concept of purgatory, the whole concept of indulgences in the Middle Ages,
Mm-hmm.
all those things have grown up. And I would make a similar analogy in the 40K universe, where to the Space Marines, that whole imperial sort of back culture
Mm-hmm.
is something slightly offbeat. It's its own thing. And that kind of was what was in my head, and that's why I gave them all. They've all got those Primarchs behind them. The Primarchs are almost like guardian angels, or
Mm-hmm.
their aspect of godhood,
Exactly.
if you like.
Whether the
Yeah,
Legion
and
wants
again,
it or not, in some
yeah,
cases.
and again, I'm a little bit reluctant to talk in religious terms about these things, because I wouldn't like people to think that it's disrespectful.
Right.
But I tend to think in those terms. It's because it's a medieval mindset.
Exactly.
That's behind it all.
But it's almost, I mean, taking that analogy, not the religious aspect of it, but religious warrior knights. I mean, these are almost space knights. If you are going to take,
Yeah.
to continue just that train of thought, you have people who are, the Templars, the actual Templars, who went out and crusaded, and then you have, or the Crusaders, I should say, and then you have,
and in fact,
version.
we're banned, and then the Templars ended by being destroyed, by being routed out as heretics.
Mm-hmm.
They were literally the Horus Heresy in reality. They were perceived as that. I think they were set up, in fact, but they were campaigned against, I think, and
right.
in the end destroyed.
Because they no longer fit the universe that they fit the world that they, at one point helped protect and create.
Yeah. There were also massive political force as well, I believe. I think it's that sort of those sort of rivalries. And that degree of sophistication is always something I saw as being behind a lot of this stuff. And I'd write about it. I sometimes later on did write about it.
Mm-hmm.
But I think when other people brought stuff in, they didn't bring that kind of those elements in. And that's why I can usually recognise what I've done, because I would do a lot of stuff that's referencing and door opening.
Mm-hmm.
And often when other people brought stuff in, they would do stuff that was contained and door closing.
Mm-hmm.
I tried to discourage it, but
Yeah, exactly. Yep. It's not all your show anymore, sadly.
No, quite. And a lot of things that people are very.
Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, go on.
Well, I was going to ask you specifically. I was going to segue to the piece of art that I would say haunted me most when I was 12 years old, and that's page 137.
Let's have a look.
For those following at home, it is the Emperor on his throne.
Yeah, okay.
And that was, if that isn't the cover of a metal album, I don't know what is.
That's Will Reese, isn't it?
Yeah.
This was commissioned out of house, so probably John Blanche would have commissioned it, and quite what influence John had over it, I don't know. But all these pictures that are in that style, that almost woodcut style, were by Will Reese, and he was only a young fella, and I think he went on to work in the film industry. So he became quite successful. But at the time, he did a number of pieces for this, and I can't imagine how long they would have taken him, because there's so much work in here.
Yeah.
But that just appeared out of nowhere.
On page 143, there's the picture of the Adeptus Mechanicus with their hoods pulled back, and that's almost as horrifying. But to jump back to the Emperor, I mean, to have the Emperor on the throne, it's almost like nobody's home, and no one's running the asylum on this massive organization that's basically running humankind in space. For me as a kid, that was, shocking. There was nothing else I'd ever seen like that, and it was the dark, in the in the 41st millennium, there's only war and, the grim, dark future. And it was summed up for me that that there was, nobody in charge per se.
Yeah, it's like an eternal state of sacrifice, isn't it? Like the emperor is almost like a machine, operating as a machine, and his level of consciousness is debatable and drifts in there. I did read the description of the emperor before we started. Well, when we agreed we were going to talk, and I must say it's all there. It is all there. It is quite creepy, but it is all there.
It is.
Yeah, I was quite pleased when I read it, because I was, it's a long time ago. So we're talking something I wrote, 40 years ago, but 1987. So I was wondering whether it stood up, but yeah, it does.
It definitely does. Although it is funny, though, one of the sentences, it is ironic that this creature whose will extends over 1 million worlds is now unable to leave the life-giving machinery of his imperial throne. I just think it's amazing that you refer to the emperor as this creature. How that is heretical these days. But yeah, I was reading it and went, wow, that stands out. Well, let's jump forward a little bit here, Rick, because I think we're talking about some of my favorite parts. Sorry. Let's go to the game's release. I mean, clearly it's gonna be popular. The resources are being put into it. You talked about how originally it was going to be fantasy models with sort of weapons packs that you could convert, but then it became something more. I mean, clearly it sounds like you guys had an idea that this was going to be a great game, but at what point did it become 40K? I mean, because that's because I played the game at Rogue Trader with no expansions, no White Dwarfs, no nothing, because it was in the United States and Japan at the time, and it was hard for me to get anything else. For the first year and a half, I played nothing but the book. And then I got my grubby paws on Compendium, and it changed because the models were available in Japan, but the books weren't. And I went back to the States and I got Compendium, the red cover book, and it gave me Space Marine army lists and Imperial Guard army lists and all the army lists that I wanted, and that dramatically changed the way I played the game.
Yeah, I think those compendiums were compendiums of White Dwarf articles, weren't they?
Yes, they were. Correct.
Yeah, so all those things that appeared in White Dwarf, pretty much as soon as Rogue Trader came out. Do you know, I think Rogue Trader turned into 40K, if I can make the difference between that role-playing game and a war game, pretty much overnight, almost before it came out. It's one of those things that this is a factor of it being written before it really became a popular thing or something that was going to be big. So I think the realization that we would need army lists for armies or forces for people to play head-to-head games was recognized right from the beginning. And I think the first supplement was called Adeptus Astartes, the Book of the Astronomicon. Chapter approved.
I was going to say it's something else.
Approved.
Yeah. And it's like a campaign book, but it's one of the hardest books to acquire.
Yes, because Brian didn't like it for some reason. I'm not quite sure. I don't think he liked I think what happened was it was probably being Brian that recognised we wanted army lists very early on. Well, as soon as it looked as if science fiction might sell, wait a minute, what's going on here? It was where are the army lists for it? Well, there aren't army lists, Brian, because science fiction doesn't sell. So I've created a small level skirmish game which doesn't have specific models. Oh, you fool, Priestley. We'll have to get someone else to do army lists. Okay. So I think he asked someone else to do army lists. I was probably busy doing something else. And I wouldn't have been particularly interested anyway, because I'd kind of created a game which I thought was a game.
Yeah.
It didn't need army lists. So he would probably have briefed someone else to do Army List, and I think it was Alan Merritt. And we stuck that in with my campaign, which was something I'd written originally to go in the book, so I already had that written. And for some reason, Brian really didn't like that book, so much so that we always referred to it as chapter disapproved.
That's hilarious.
Yeah. And refused to let it be reprinted.
Yeah. It's
So,
one of the hardest things to find. It's something like
Yeah, well, that's why.
$400 on eBay to this day.
Yeah, not worth it. Somebody ought to scan it.
Somebody
Stick it up.
has, in fact, and I only just read it for the first time maybe 3 or 4 years ago. And it, it was glorious to see something out of this era and to finally read it, because I devoured everything I could since then, but I'd never seen that, because it's the closest thing to Rogue Trader that isn't Rogue Trader, if that makes sense.
It is, yeah. And in fact, it includes that, as I say, that original scenario that I did write to go in. I intended to go into Rogue Trader. It might even be the first time the Horus Heresy is mentioned.
I believe it is, yeah.
Yeah, because I did that as a piece of. I used to do short bits of text, which were filler text. So you do lots of short bits of text. You just brainstorm them, and sometimes if they're in a group of people, you say, "Anyone get no ideas?" and they just throw the ideas at you. So sometimes you pick up ideas from other people, but I just did a lot of those, and one of the bits I did was that Horus Heresy text, which is just trying to. I said about opening doors. Well, Rogue Trader does talk about the great wars at the start of the Imperium and how the Imperium was reunified. And the Horus Heresy is like a little bit of one step through that open door, and yet opening more doors. Because at the time when the Emperor was reunified, but then there was that bit of backsliding. The chapters that are out there are reconquering the human world and bringing the Imperium together, and yet fall victim to chaos. Even though they've been armored in mind and body against the incursions of chaos, yet that was always going to be a corruption. The theme of Rogue Trader is really about that corruption of the psychically emerging humanity. And it just seemed like a natural story to me, and I called it the Horus Heresy because I rather like the sound of it. And I think I invented Horus in that process. And from that bit of colour text, and it's a parallel of Satan, the fall of Satan, the fall of Lucifer. Fairly obviously, if you read it, it talks about a third part of the hosts of the Imperium. As in, third part of the hosts of heaven falling in.
Exactly.
And he just parallel that. And I think what I had at the back of my head was both the fall of Lucifer in terms of the Christian backstory, but also in terms of Milton, Paradise Lost.
Yes.
That first book of Paradise Lost, which has that. It's almost genetically engineered into me, that description of the fall of Satan and how he falls through what Milton calls chaos. He falls through chaos, and they all land on the sea of fire in hell. And really, I just riffed on that. Probably nearly dinner time. There you go. Stick that down. It was very much like that. You have to remember. And it then got picked up for the epic Space Marine game.
Yeah. There's
a theme, and I had nothing to do with that. That really was something that was I don't know. I have no idea even where the idea for it came from. I mean, the concept of doing a micro game was always there. It was something which had been there since day one for games for Blizzard Citadel. I mean, when we're going to do a micro game, when we're going to do a spaceship game, when we're going to do a naval game, when we're going to, that was we were all gamers. That was just part of it. But Jervis picked it up. I don't know who wrote the background for the Horus Heresy. It wasn't me, I don't think. I might have contributed to it, but I don't remember doing.
Well, Rick, I've pulled open the book and
okay.
development, Graham Davis. Cover art,
Yeah.
Jim Burns, and game design, Jervis Johnson.
Yeah. Graham would have written probably written the background text for that.
Mm-hmm.
He's a very good professional writer. Graham. He would take the theme very well. Graham and I and Nigel Stillman had the singular quality of being archaeology graduates. So all three of us kind of had that shared sense of deep history.
Okay,
how
Rick.
deep history works and how deep society works.
So,
right?
Rick, how many times have we talked now? It's a lot, and you're
Many.
only gonna way to bury the lead. You are an archaeology major?
Yeah.
That's amazing. I didn't know that.
Yeah. Yeah, I went to college to do a degree in classics and ancient history, and as part of which I did archaeology in my first year, and I quite enjoyed the archaeology. And in the end, I switched. So I switched to an archaeology degree, which meant I didn't take the final classics courses, which is probably a good thing, really, because my Latin was shocking. I sort of stumbled through the dictionary, really, and my Greek was non-existent. So, which I'd have had to have really picked up my Latin, and I don't think I could have done it. I've really got almost no gift for languages whatsoever. So, I did an archaeology degree.
Nice.
At Lancaster University.
Well, you can see, I mean, clearly, just in the confines of this conversation, you can hear you referencing historical organizations, armor, biblical references. I mean, classics. I mean, just the sheer number of places where I think that is one of the wonderful things about the original Warhammer 40K universe that is, carries through to today, is how much feels familiar. It's such a deep and rich universe, but without its basis being so rooted in human stories that we are familiar with, I don't think it would have resonated as well as it did.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? I mean, I mean, I think doing a degree in archaeology gives you a very good basis for world building, role-playing context or a gaming context or a fictional context for that matter, any kind of fiction. But I did a degree in archaeology because I was interested in that kind of stuff. I mean, it wasn't it didn't create my interest. I was already interested in ancient societies and history and everything like that. And also to some extent, I was always interested in. I know it sounds weird, but I was always interested in religion and belief as a concept, although I'm not in any way religious. I'm not at all religious. I should emphasize that. But when I was a kid, my mother became a Jehovah's Witness. So as a young child, I got to go to Kingdom Hall, which is where Jehovah's Witnesses go.
Yep.
And sit there whilst the various ceremonies and speeches and things go on. And I remember once being taken to Kingdom Hall by my mother when I must have been quite small, on one of these occasions when the world was due to end.
Oh,
right.
wow.
So your mother gets you. Right then, young Richard, we're going to go to Kingdom Hall and sit there and wait for the world to end. Okay, Mum. I think I might have been mildly sceptical even as an infant, but and I can remember it to this day. We sat there, and the person giving the I don't know what it would be. It would be a presentation, speech, or whatever, conducting the ceremony, and we all sat there very quietly until the world didn't end, and then went home. But he kind of left a bit of an impression on me.
Okay. I gotta ask, what's that like? I mean, you gotta wonder. Being in the world's gonna end. The world's gonna end. The world's gonna end. Oh, it didn't end. Okay, I'll see you here next Tuesday. Like, how does that work?
Well, as a small child, you think this is all rubbish, isn't it? I became an atheist very quickly.
Yeah, I can see that.
And I can only remember being not religious, since I was a child. I don't think I've ever had any genuine religious belief. But nonetheless, I find it fascinating, and it's one of the driving forces in most cultures and civilizations.
It is.
When you've got a unified culture is generally motivated and unified by a common sense of belief. You don't get the modern Western society is very peculiar in that respect, and to some extent it's interesting whether it actually is sustainable on that basis. We shall see. But that's what drives the Imperium. You've got that common sense of belief. Yeah.
Rick, that is the deepest this podcast has ever gone. Thank you for that. That was you got me pondering the universe.
Well,
yes.
I said I didn't do a classics degree. In fact, what I did was an archaeology degree, but we were allowed to do other units, and what the classics unit I did was on ancient Greek religion.
Mm-hmm.
So I actually did quite a bit on Greek religion, which includes mostly history of things like the festivals and the processes of celebration, and some of the Bacchic stuff actually worked its way into 40K. So you get things like the omophagos, which is the eating of raw flesh, and the original Bacchic revels. They would tear somebody apart and eat them, and later on it became a goat, some sort of animal. But they would literally tear it apart and eat it. And I incorporated that idea into the Space Marines, from the Space Marines rituals.
Yes, because there are even Space Marine chapters named after that. Flesh tearers and the Flesh Eaters, and the Blood Drinkers.
Yep. The Sparagmos is the tearing apart,
and
so that would be the ritual tearing apart, and the omophagos is the eating of the raw flesh. Yeah.
Amazing. Awesome.
So there you go. There was some point in education. After all, it wasn't wasted.
Well, I can't wait to tell my mom, look how much I learned playing Warhammer 40,000 when I was a teenager. Take that, Mom. All right. Well, so we segued, and you did mention that Warhammer Rogue Trader took a heavy, I don't want to say a direction, left hand, right hand, doesn't matter, turned hard. Somebody pulled the e-brake, and I guess that would be Brian, and it went into the direction of more of a war game. Now, did you follow? I mean, I know you were working on other projects, and I know that a lot of other people took on the Army List creation, for example, but you were still contributing to quite a few articles. I was in going through some of the books and going through some of the old White Dwarf articles. You were still contributing heavily throughout the Rogue Trader era and later. What became your role in that? And and I'll save my next question for next. So was yours more of a world building? I mean, I know you wrote the Cyclone rules for Terminators, and as I mentioned before, the armor marks. And I mean, where were you going?
I think I was just a games designer. I think initially I had a huge sort of sense of it being my game, not least because it's got my name on it.
Yes.
And felt that I ought to be the person kind of driving it, and I did a lot to do that in those White Dwarf articles. But the problem was, the needs of business meant that it probably needed to be driven in a direction that I wasn't always very comfortable with, and I couldn't keep up. And in essence, the work got distributed amongst other people, and because it was so successful. Success tends to attract attention, and all of a sudden, models appeared, and generally, it wouldn't be that I'd said, "Oh, let's be great to have this in the game or that in the game." What would happen to be, I'd be sat at my desk, and somebody would plonk a model. Usually, one of the White Dwarf staff would plonk a model on my desk and go, "Oh, this is the latest model for Space Marines. We need some text for 5 o'clock." And it'd be about lunchtime. And I'd look at this and go, "What is it?" And they say, "Oh, it's a missile launcher for Space Marine. It's called a Cyclone, or Terminator Space Marine. It's called Cyclone." They call it a Cyclone. They go, "Well, what is it?" I go, "Oh, it fires missiles off the bat here." And I go, "Yeah, okay." And is that it? They go, "Yeah, we don't know." It's like, that's what he does.
Yeah.
And then I'd write it up.
Yeah.
We need it for 5 o'clock, by the way,
Yeah.
because White Dwarf goes to print. And
you
that's
go,
how those things
"Thanks."
got done.
Yeah. Oh, that's funny. Well, I have to ask then. There is one particular article that has been a fan favorite, and I know over the years has had people. It is a wonderful open door. And I would like to ask you specifically about it, because it is from this era. And it is an Index Astartes White Dwarf article that was reprinted in Compendium. And it was what, 5-6 paragraphs of text and
Right.
2 color pages of alternate camouflage Space Marine outfits for new chapters. And it was called The Babdab War.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Was that one of those I mean, how?
Yeah.
Yeah, I
That
mean,
would be almost
that's like the
exactly that.
Horus Heresy. It almost was its own thing. And in fact, it is. It's a Forge World book. It's been expanded unbelievably in recent years. But
Yes.
yeah.
They've plunged through those doors with some enthusiasm, haven't they?
Yes, they have.
Yeah, what would have happened there would have been, I think, you see, I would just be considered at this point to be a writer, games designer. I'd just be doing work as needed. I wouldn't be Mr. 40K.
Right.
There probably was no such thing. I'd imagine because it was so successful, it would be something where Brian would probably say to Alan Merritt, "Oh, we need a range of these. Go and sort it out." And it was really driven by the figure design as much as anything else. And I think in the case of those Space Marine chapters, it would have been. I suspect again Brian would have Brian put a lot of work into 40K because he could see where it was going. You know, he could see it was successful. I mean, to some extent, he jumped on board the bandwagon, but he also kind of directed the bandwagon.
The battle wagon, one might say. Sorry.
Yep, exactly. He was, and he would probably have asked for that to be done because he's just expanding out the. I mean, I'm guessing here because I don't really know.
Yeah.
But from my point of view, what happened was I was presented with some artwork for Space Marine chapters, and I think they had names with them. I think Gary Chalk do the artwork for those? I should say on it.
Hold on, let me go back. I don't know. I'm having trouble actually finding the page again, Rick. Sorry about that. I closed the book the second we. Oh, here we go.
It's just that I've got this vague memory. Remember, we are talking 30 years ago or more.
Yeah, no, it doesn't actually say who did the art.
Okay.
Gary Chalk. It's in the corner.
Yeah,
sure
okay. Yeah, I know where we are. Yeah, Gary Chalk did those, and he pretty much made them up or was directed to make things along those lines. So when they hit me, I look at these and I go, "Oh, what's this got to do with 40K? Or what's this got to do with Rogue Trader?" I do, and you go, "Oh, what's this?" Okay, and I would have made up that Badab story to knit everything together. So, generally that's a lot of Rogue Trader and 40K. And a lot of stuff in the early days was joining dots and making something out of a tapestry of material that you had, and making it seem as if it's all whole and coherent and well thought out, whereas in fact it was completely anarchic.
Well, you fooled us, Rick. You did a really good job.
Objective achieved.
Yeah. Oh, mate. Rick, we have been talking for 1 hour and 40 minutes now, and I have only scratched the surface of my questions, but I think we've touched on a lot of the big points. Are there any historical anecdotes or anything that we've missed in your recollections of the time? I know you put a lot of thought into and looking back at your notes and before coming on today. Is there anything that you think that people might want to hear that maybe they haven't, or maybe clear something up or share a story, an embarrassing story about John Stoller? It's always good, but did I say that out loud?
I would never do that.
Yes.
Oh, well, there was that time.
Yes. Have I told you about the time that I played John Stollard in 40K? And he said, I don't do that
No.
sort of thing. Oh, yes. I will share one quick story. Sorry, fans. So I worked for John in sales, and I don't know how I bullied him into it, given that he was the CEO of Games Workshop US at that point. I know. Our boss left the company. I actually went to work in retail, and so I had no direct sales manager during the Christmas season, which was a big deal at that point. And so I reported directly to John because he wanted to make sure that our team, which was a big money earner, didn't all of a sudden die because morale went out the window. And so he took control with, like John does. And it was terrifying for me as a young man. It was my first job out of university. And I made John a lot of money. And John would pat me on the head affectionately like Santa Claus and waddle off, do his thing. And John Matthews would come by and kick me in the bottom of the chair and tell me to make more money, usually with a lot more expletives attached. But one day I said, John, I would like to play you in Warhammer 40,000. And because that's my game. And he said, I don't do that. We can play these other games. And including his Black Powder rules, Warhammer Black Powder. And I said, nope, we're going to play 40K. And somehow he agreed to it. And he borrowed another salesman's Space Marine army, Imperial Fists. And I played my Arbites army. And he had to put up with me in his best humor. And I think this tells you a lot about, and this is for the listener, me as a human being back in the day. I may have, because I was playing Arbites, done a lot of bad impressions of Sylvester Stallone saying I am the law throughout that game. And I think by the end he had to politely leave and have someone else put the army away. But he always did say nice things to me after that. I don't know. I love John. Anyway, sorry. Did that anecdote give you anything to think about?
Ironic, isn't it, that the sales director of Games Workshop had no real interest in science fiction or fantasy?
Who would have thunk?
It's a bit like the Perry twins.
Yes.
Who have actually no interest in fantasy or science fiction, managed to work for Games Workshop for about 30 or 40 years.
And were in Lord of the Rings.
Yeah. Well, they sort of were they're sort of like Lord of the Rings, and they've had that kind of that thing going. But even there, they've kept doing stuff for Peter Jackson. But I think all the things they've kept doing are all historical things to do with World War One. Like they make the pilot figures for the Wingnuts range of plastic World War One airplanes, which are wholly owned by Peter Jackson. Yeah,
I didn't know that. Learn something new every day.
Yeah,
nice.
You do.
Well, let's shift back to. Yep, go ahead.
I was going to say no. I think that's pretty much covered. I'm sure. I bet there's stuff which will occur to both of us as soon as we
5 seconds
as
from
we
now.
stop talking. But
as usual, send a couple messages after we finish recording. Forgot. Yeah. Oh, Rick, it has been an absolute pleasure walking down memory lane with you because, I mean, as I've said in many a Cast Dice and Warlord Cast introduction, Warhammer 40,000 really did, significantly change the way I look at gaming, changed my interests in the world, and has largely ended up, responsible for me being where I am now. Because I would have never worked for Games Workshop if I hadn't been playing Warhammer 40,000 in a grand tournament and been hired by staff pretty much at the bar afterward. Funny story. But, I am one of a countless legion, a nameless legion, faceless legion of people who have played this game. I'd like to think that I'm some sort of original snowflake out there, political connotations of that aside. that, my story is an original one. It's a different one. But so many people have in the gaming industry, either people who create their own games, people who create their own models. Game companies have been largely trained by former games or are largely ex-Games Workshop staff. But all of that comes down to Games Workshop's success is largely come down to 40K existing in the first place. And Rogue Trader is the origins of that, and that comes back to you. You have a hell of a legacy, Mr. Priestley. So a giant hats off to you, sir. And I know this is making you feel very uncomfortable, as this is not something you like talking about. However,
you're lucky I'm still here.
Yeah, exactly. I was like, Rick, you there? And gone. I guess we've talked a little bit about that, but have you considered the larger global implications of the beast you created? You are the original gaming Frankenstein. Well, maybe not the original, but you are one of the largest of all time. You are Dr. Frankenstein, and 40K keeps going and going well past your creation date.
Yeah, I know. It's kind of like the seed, isn't it? But it wouldn't have been so successful had it not been for all those illustrators and model makers and everyone else who's gone towards making the whole thing what it is. I do consider that it's been a fairly major influence, and I think one of the things I've always been very proud of is the fact that so many people have not just played and enjoyed, but actually made a living out of what is effectively is 40K. Mm-hmm. We've for many years put food on people's tables and sent people's kids to school. Mm-hmm. Not just working in the studio, but in the factories and warehouse and everything. So, yeah, I think what Games Workshop is today does, as you say, owes a lot to 40K. I tend to think there's actually a little bit of text somewhere. Yeah, it's on page 143. Mm-hmm. I'll just leave you with page 143, the text. Mm-hmm. And there you go. You look at the bottom. I think I was anticipating this very thing.
Sorry, I'm still 147, 143. A man may die, yet still endure it, if his work enters the greater work. Time is carried upon a current, incepted by forgotten deeds. Events of a great moment are but the culmination of a single carefully placed thought. As all men must thank progenitors obscured by the past, we must endure to the present, that those who come after may continue the greater work. Fantastic.
Yep, there
you go. Yep. Wise words, Rick. Wise words. And you would have written that, as you said.
Yeah, I've never read that.
Oof. Well, on behalf of myself and countless others who are hopefully listening to this today, I would like to say thank you for your part in making sure that this happened and being Bullock stubborn enough just that it did happen in the first place. You have literally changed the face of the gaming industry, and I, for one, have gotten decades of joy out of the game that you have created. And as I said, without its ripples going off into the ether, Lord knows what we'd have in the gaming industry today. So, thank you.
You're very welcome.
All right. On that note, I think I'm going to stop making Rick feel awkward, and we will move on. Rick, thank you so much for coming on today. It is always a pleasure to have you on and just to talk shop. And this has just been one of my favorite podcasts ever to record. This episode has been pure joy for me. So thank you for making the time and for joining us and for sharing your thoughts and experiences.
That's all right. It's a pleasure. And it's very kind of you to put up with me blathering on for nearly 2 hours.
Rick, I
think I might have to go and
Yeah.
Yeah, I might have to go and have a cup of tea now.
I am going to join you for that cup of tea because I have one in the other room that I'm sure is ice cold at this point.
Yeah, yeah. You might microwave it. It'll be fine.
Exactly. Oh,
All right.
well,
Cheers then, Brad.
thank you. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. I'm sure that a couple of you listening today, this will be your first ever episode of Cast Ice. Thank you for putting up with my fanboyish worship of the one and only Rick Priestley Rogue Trader. But yes, Cast Ice is a podcast that explores the greater world of gaming. I don't usually gush and blush like this, but it is a subject close to my heart. Please join us again at some other point or check out our back catalog. There's a lot of episodes about a lot of games, and I've had some pretty spectacular guests in the past that have had a lot of wonderful things to say. So please check us out. And we are just developing a YouTube channel as well. There are some interesting YouTube videos there about how you can portray G.I. Joe, Star Wars, and other wonderful games like Mask and other nostalgic favorites on the tabletop. But ladies and gentlemen, if you are looking for us and you'd like to give us feedback for future episodes, please go to Facebook and search up Cast Dice, CASTDICE, and message the page. There is only one person who does this, and that is me. My name is Brad. Hi. And if you message that page, you are guaranteed a response by yours truly. But as my good friend Casey always says, there is only one way to end this show, and that is when you are playing the games that we know and love. I hope your dice roll hot. I hope your beverages are cold. But more than anything else, we at Cast Ice hope that you have fun. Stay safe out there, guys. Good night.
Another day rise in Paraguayan sun. The food cracks open. Another Heineken. He's all alone. He's in his little room. He's all alone with a Burmese python and a loaded He sleeps by day, but not for very long. He dozes off, and that's when the chase is on. In his dreams, one who knows that scent, faceless men with Russian winter. That sweaty little man on the tropical Capricorn without a tan. Neatest man this world has seen. Beat up every night in his dreams. His friends are gone, and they've tracked the hungry hounds. The ruby's gone, and the terrorists